Hello guys. Tonight we begin with a journey through winter days that rarely make it into the stories of the Wild West. You usually hear about the dry heat, the dust rising behind a rider, or the glow of lanterns in a noisy saloon. But tonight, we will let all that fade away. Tonight, we will step into the snow, into cabins where the walls creaked with every gust of wind, into nights that seemed to have no end. Asterisk, it was not about bravery, not the kind that movies like to show. It was about patience, about improvising with what little there was, and about waiting for the air to soften again. A blanket pulled close, a fire that could not be allowed to die, and the slow rhythm of days when silence seemed thicker than the cold itself. Asterisk, but before we begin, let me gently invite you to subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and want to join us again sometime. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, so let me know where you're watching from, and what time it is there. Asterisk, dim the lights, let the shadows settle. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Prepare yourself for a calm and steady rhythm, where each image of the past unfolds like frost melting slowly on a window. Asterisk, now, let's ease into tonight's journey together when the cold did not ask for permission to enter, and survival meant more than just courage. It meant listening to the creak of wood, watching the glow of embers, and trusting that spring would come again, no matter how far away it seemed at the time. Asterisk, you can almost imagine the weight of silence when the snow piled up against the doorway. The world outside disappeared into a blank expanse, and suddenly all that remained was the sound of breathing inside the cabin, the crackle of wood burning, and the creak of your own bones as you tried to curl tighter against the cold. It was a kind of solitude that did not come only from distance between neighbors, but from the isolation forced by the season itself. Even the most familiar trails could vanish overnight, buried beneath layers of ice, as if the landscape had decided to erase its own paths. Asterisk, in the Wild West, winter was not a season to be admired. It was a constant presence, heavy and unwelcome, almost like a guest who refused to leave. The wind came in uninvited, whistling through every crack, tugging at thin curtains that swayed even when the windows were firmly shut. It was as though the cabin itself breathed along with the storm. The wooden beams groaned in reply, reminding everyone inside that nothing about these walls was permanent or guaranteed. Asterisk, and yet people endured. They pressed blankets to the doorframe, stuffed rags into gaps between the boards, and listened to the sound of the wind as if it were a companion they could not ignore. Some nights it felt as if the entire house might lift from the ground and scatter into the snow, yet it stayed, holding warmth in small doses. Never quite enough, but never entirely absent either. Asterisk, each moment was measured not by hours, but by the rise and fall of the fire in the stove. The glow was not steady. It flared, it dimmed, it demanded constant attention, and in that rhythm, life moved forward. To leave it unattended was to risk more than discomfort. The fire was survival, and so the night was spent not in deep sleep, but in light dozing, waking, again and again to feed the flames. Asterisk, there was no glamour in this, no dramatic speeches, no heroic gestures. Just the steady sound of logs splitting, the careful saving of scraps, the endless layering of fabric over fabric, until a body felt weighed, down not only by clothing, but by the long weight of winter itself. It was a season that taught patience, because there was no other choice. Asterisk, the cold was not only outside. It seeped through the floorboards, rose from the ground itself, and lingered inside even when the fire glowed bright. You could place your hands close to the stove until they almost burned, but only a few steps away, the air returned to biting, sharp, impossible to ignore. Rooms had corners that never warmed, where frost seemed to settle like a stubborn shadow. A chair placed there would remain icy no matter how long it sat. Asterisk nights stretched endlessly. The darkness came early, swallowing the horizon before most. Chores could be finished, and then it held on until morning with a grip that felt eternal. People tried to measure the hours with small routines. Another log on the fire, another mug of hot water, another quiet glance at the frosted window pane. But the minutes felt heavy, the kind of time that refused to move forward. Asterisk outside, the snow muffled every sound. A horse's hoof on the frozen ground was softer than a whisper. Footsteps vanished almost as soon as they were made. Even voices carried strangely, dulled by the thick air, as if the world itself wanted everything to stay hushed. It was not silence exactly, but something denser, a stillness that pressed in from all sides. Asterisk, and inside the cabins, people listened. To the groan of the roof under fresh snow, to the sigh of wind searching for gaps between boards, to the slow crackle of sap releasing from burning wood. Each sound was a reminder. The walls were thin, the season was unforgiving, and every detail mattered. Nothing could be wasted. Not food, not fire, not energy. Asterisk winter was not a backdrop to the Wild West. It was a character of its own, shaping every decision, every habit, every breath that turned to frost in the air. To survive meant to adjust, to wait, and to believe that even the longest night would eventually break into dawn. Asterisk, there was no certainty in those winters. A sudden storm could erase a week of careful planning. A pile of firewood that once looked generous could vanish in a handful of days. A barrel of beans might become the only comfort between hunger and endurance. Every family, every traveler, every lone settler learned to read the season like a stern teacher, patient with no one, forgiving of nothing. Asterisk, and yet there was a strange beauty in it. The frost on the window pane formed delicate patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like sketches drawn by an invisible hand. The snow outside sparkled under the pale light of the moon, so bright that it almost hurt the eyes, reflecting a world both empty and endless. Even the sharp bite of the wind carried a certain clarity, a reminder that the earth itself was alive, restless, untamed. Asterisk life slowed to match the season. Words were spoken less often. Movements were measured. Thoughts stretched across long hours. The body longed for warmth, but the mind adjusted to the rhythm of survival, not rushing, not resisting, simply enduring. And in that endurance there was a kind of quiet dignity, a resilience that belonged not to the heroes of stories, but to ordinary people who endured extraordinary cold. Asterisk. So when we speak of the Wild West, it is not enough to imagine only the heat of the desert sun or the dust rising behind wagons. We must also step into the silence of winter, into the drafty cabins and the long frozen nights where every flame mattered. For it was in those winters, perhaps more than anywhere else, that survival became a story in itself. Asterisk, and that, my friends, is where our journey begins tonight, with the creak of wood, the whisper of wind through forgotten cracks, and the stubborn strength of those who waited for spring with nothing more than fire, patience, and the hope that the walls around them would hold. Asterisk, but that was only the beginning. For if survival meant anything during those frozen months, it started with the place meant to protect you, the cabin itself. A shelter, yes, but never entirely safe from the cold. The walls were thin, the floors were bare, and the wind seemed to know every hidden path inside. Asterisk. And so, let us step closer to that doorway, where the snow gathers high, where the hinges groan with every push of the storm, and where the smallest cracks become a passageway for winter to slip in. The cabin was never truly sealed. It stood there, built from logs cut quickly, stacked with determination, but not with perfection. And Winter noticed every gap. The wind had a way of finding its path, slipping through spaces no wider than a finger, curling around ankles, lifting the edge of a blanket, reminding everyone inside that walls were only a suggestion against the cold. Asterisk at night, when the lantern was turned low and the fire shrank to embers, the cabin spoke in its own language. The beams groaned, the roof cracked softly under the weight of new snow, and the smallest seams became whistling mouths, filling the silence with their thin, steady song. Curtains, if there were any, quivered against windows that were never quite shut. A draft would tug at the fabric like a child pulling at a sleeve, playful in its persistence, but merciless in its chill. Asterisk, people stuffed what they could into the gaps. Old rags, strips of cloth, scraps of animal hide pressed into corners where boards no longer met. Sometimes mud was smeared into cracks, freezing solid like clay, a temporary shield until it crumbled again. And still, the air pushed through, as though determined to be part of the household. Asterisk, the floor was no comfort either. Cold rose from the earth itself, creeping between the boards until feet ached inside their boots. Some nights, it felt as though the ground beneath the cabin was breathing out frost, filling the space with a chill that could not be tamed. A rug, if one was available, did little more than soften the step. The cold seeped through anyway, patient and unstoppable. Asterisk imagined sitting in such a place, wrapped in layers, watching your breath turn into small clouds that drifted and vanished. Before your eyes, the fire glowed a few feet away, but the corners of the room remained untouched, places where no warmth dared to settle. You could press your palm against the wall and feel the outside world pressing back, a reminder that this thin barrier of wood was all that stood between survival and exposure. Asterisk, and yet people endured within these cabins. They laughed when the curtain lifted unexpectedly. They sighed when the wind grew loud. They carried on with daily chores despite the constant reminder that comfort was not part of the bargain. Survival meant adjusting, and so the cabins became both sanctuary and adversary, a fragile home that welcomed and betrayed in equal measure. Asterisk, but this was only one part of winter's challenge. For inside those walls, warmth was always fleeting. And outside, in the woods and fields, the real work awaited, the endless labor of gathering fuel, the only currency that mattered once the snow began to fall. Asterisk, the cabin itself seemed alive. In winter, but not in a comforting way. It sighed, it shivered, it carried the weight of storms on its roof, as if groaning under a burden it had not been built to bear. Each gust of wind tested its strength, and each test reminded those inside of its fragility. The boards were nailed in place, yes, but nails loosened with time, and the wind always found them, rattling them like loose teeth. Asterisk, a chair placed near the wall never stayed there for long. Anyone who sat too close would feel the invisible fingers of the cold creeping through the seams. It wasn't the sudden kind of chill, but something slower, more cunning, seeping little by little until it claimed the body from the toes upward. Blankets helped, but only in layers, heavy piles that turned. Movement into effort. And even then, the cold found ways in, slipping through the smallest gap, as if it had all the patience in the world. Asterisk at night, the sound of the wind was constant, but never the same. Sometimes it moaned low, deep and steady, as though the earth itself was sighing. Other times it shrieked in short bursts, slipping through cracks with the sharpness of a knife. It was never truly silent. Even in calm weather, the draft whispered along the edges of the room, brushing the skin with a reminder that comfort was temporary. Fleeting, fragile. Asterisk children felt it most. They would burrow under blankets, only their noses visible, and still. They shivered. Some cabins had gaps so wide you could see a sliver of moonlight or the faint glint of snowflakes drifting outside. Families did what they could. Rugs pressed against doorways, skins hung on walls like clumsy insulation, buckets placed where snowmelt found its way in during the rare days when ice began to loosen. Asterisk. The smell inside such a cabin was a mixture of many things. Smoke from the stove that never quite left the air, damp fabric that never dried completely, and the faint mustiness of earth creeping up through the floor. It wasn't unpleasant, not entirely. It was survival's perfume, the scent of wood, of labor, of life carried through another frozen night. Asterisk, there was a rhythm to this existence. Check the fire. Adjust the blankets. Listen for the storm's pressure on the walls. Check the fire again. It was a cycle as steady as breathing, repeated so often that it became second nature. The cabin was not a fortress against winter. It was a fragile bubble of warmth suspended in a sea of ice, always under siege, always demanding attention. Asterisk end. Yet despite its flaws, despite the drafts and the sighs and the endless battle with frost, the cabin was a lifeline. It was the place where families huddled, where stories were told, where the darkness of the season was softened by the glow of embers. A place where even the thinnest walls meant the difference between life and death. Asterisk. But survival inside those walls depended on something more than rags stuffed into cracks and blankets piled high. It depended on the fuel that fed the flames. The only true wealth of a frontier winter.asterisk life inside those drafty cabins was a balance between gratitude and frustration. Grateful because there was at least a roof, something to slow the storm, a fragile barrier between a family and the merciless. Winter. Frustrated because the barrier was never quite enough. There were nights when the wind grew so strong that it seemed to push through the very boards, rattling the structure until every nail trembled. In those hours, it was easy to believe this whole house might scatter into the snow. Asterisk, people learned to live with these constant reminders of weakness. A blanket was never folded neatly. It was always ready to be pulled tighter. A curtain was never decorative. It was another defense against a restless draft. Even the placement of beds was strategic, close enough to the stove for warmth, but not so near the wall that frost could creep across the mattress by morning. Every detail mattered. Asterisk. There was also a sound unique to these cabins, one that came only in the deepest of winter. It was the thin whistle of air sliding through hairline cracks, a tone so soft it was almost music. On sleepless nights, when the fire dimmed and silence thickened, that whistle became company. Some found it comforting, proof that the cabin still held, that the storm outside had not yet taken everything. Others found it maddening, a constant reminder of the cold that never left. Asterisk, children sometimes pressed their fingers into those cracks, watching the snowflakes sneak inside, tiny flecks of white melting instantly against their warm skin. To them, it was a curious trick, a little magic from the outside world. To adults, it was a warning, another sign that winter never truly stayed outside. Asterisk, the body adapted in strange ways. Toes learned to ache without complaint. Fingers grew numb so often that the tingling almost became familiar. Skin cracked, lips stung, yet still chores were done. Still laughter managed to echo faintly within the thin walls. The cabin demanded resilience, and resilience was quietly given. Asterisk, perhaps that was the true nature of these drafty shelters. They were never perfect, never secure, but they forced people to bend without breaking. They shaped habits, carved patience, and reminded every soul inside that survival was not comfort, it was persistence. Asterisk, and so, when the long nights stretched on, when the wind sang through the seams and frost settled on the window like lace, families pulled their blankets closer, listened to the cabin breathe around them, and endured. The walls might tremble, but they still stood. And within them, so did the people. Asterisk. Yet no matter how well a cabin held, no matter how many rags were stuffed into the gaps, survival always came down to a single truth. Without fire, without the steady work of splitting and stacking wood, even the strongest walls meant nothing. Which is why, in the heart of a frontier winter, wood was not just a resource. It was a treasure. You let your body sink slightly lower, sitting closer to the ground. From here, the shape of the tipi becomes more pronounced. The walls lean inward, high above, narrowing toward the opening that points directly to the sky. It feels as though the whole structure is drawing your gaze upward, guiding your breath to rise with the smoke. At the same time, the circular base anchors you, pulling your attention inward to the warmth at the center. There are no corners here, no edges for shadows to hide in. The roundness creates a sense of flow, a soft continuity that makes even the silence feel gentle. Asterisk outside. The wind roars again, and snow strikes harder against the hide. You expect the noise to intrude, to shake the calm inside, but it does not. The sound is blunted, softened, almost as if the tipi were a drum, and the storm a hand tapping against it with muted force. The rhythm becomes part of the space, rather than an invasion. You feel the vibration faintly through the ground, a reminder of the world just beyond these walls. Yet you remain within a pocket of stillness, where time seems slower, measured not by minutes, but by the crackling of embers. Asterisk your gaze returns to the entrance. It is a simple flap of hide, weighted enough to keep closed when needed, yet light enough to lift with one hand. The opening is small, deliberately so. It does not invite the cold to rush in, but allows just enough space for a person to pass. You picture the quick movement of someone entering, the flap closing swiftly behind them, the cold captured in only a brief breath before it is sealed away again. That single gesture, so ordinary, carries the weight of survival. One careless pause could let in more cold than the fire can chase away. Asterisk you realize, slowly, that nothing here is wasted. Every line, every stitch, every curve of the structure is deliberate. It is not luxury, it is not decoration. It is necessity shaped into form, and yet there is beauty in that necessity. The tipi is both simple and complex, fragile and enduring, light enough to move across the plains, strong enough to face the endless winter. It is an answer to the land itself, as if the earth and sky had asked a question. And this was the reply. Asterisk, the longer you sit here, the more you understand why generations trusted this space. It was not just walls and poles. It was a living design, one that turned storms into background noise and cold into something survivable. It gave not perfect warmth, but enough. And enough was everything. Asterisk, as the fire flickers and your eyes wander once more around the curved walls, you begin to feel the tipi less as an object and more as a presence. It holds you gently, firm yet forgiving, quiet yet never silent. The poles breathe with the wind, the hides whisper with the touch of snow, and together they create an embrace that is both fragile and unbreakable. Asterisk, the structure itself becomes a teacher. It reminds you that survival on the plains is not about overpowering nature, but about learning to move with it. The tipi bends instead of breaking, yields instead of resisting, and in that yielding finds its strength. You sense, in the glow of the firelight, that this balance between shelter and storm, between warmth and cold, between fragility and endurance, is what allowed life to continue in a land that often seemed determined to end it. Asterisk inside this circle of poles and hides, you understand that the tipi was more than a roof. It was a space of memory, of breath, of protection. It was the difference between lying awake in the open, under a merciless sky, and lying within walls that transformed the storm into something bearable. And as you listen to the muted voice of the wind outside, you feel the quiet power of a structure built not to erase the cold, but to keep it waiting just beyond reach. Asterisk here, in this balance of shape and sound, the night can be endured. And as your gaze drifts once more to the center, you realize that the true heart of this survival lies not only in the walls around you, but in the living flame that waits within. Out on the frontier, there was no currency more urgent than wood. Gold might glimmer in the stories, but gold could not keep the frost from your bones. A pile of split logs stacked neatly against the cabin wall meant survival in its simplest, most tangible form. Each piece of wood was a promise of warmth, of light, of another night endured. Asterisk, the rhythm of the axe became a winter heartbeat. Swing, crack, echo. The sound carried through the forest, bouncing off frozen trunks, sharp and hollow in the still air. Breath rose in white clouds with every strike, drifting upward only to vanish against the pale sky. A smell of freshly split wood was rich and raw, mingling with the metallic bite of cold air, a reminder that even in the dead of winter, life pulsed inside the trees. Asterisk, but the work was relentless. A woodpile that looked tall and sturdy in autumn shrank with unsettling speed. Every log tossed into the stove was a small relief, but also a subtraction from the stack outside. People counted them again and again, as though sheer attention might keep the pile from dwindling. There was always a quiet calculation in the back of the mind. How many nights left? How many storms still to come? How many logs to burn before the world softened again? Asterisk, some days the logs refused to cooperate. Freshly cut wood, still damp with sap, smoked and hissed when it met the fire. It filled the cabin with a haze that stung the eyes and clung to clothing, leaving a bitter scent that lingered long after the smoke cleared. But there was no choice. Even wet wood was better than none at all. Settlers learned to coax flames patiently, feeding them small splinters, whispering encouragement with each flicker until the fire finally caught. That moment, the flare, the crackle, the sudden bloom of heat carried a relief so deep it was almost joyed out. Asterisk hands grew rough from the work. Blisters hardened into calluses, and fingers stiffened from the constant grip of the axe. Shoulders ached, backs bent, but still the rhythm continued. Because without it, the cabin was nothing but a box of cold boards waiting to freeze its inhabitants. Firewood turned labor into survival, exhaustion into endurance. Asterisk, even children were part of the ritual. Small arms gathered twigs and branches, feeding the kindling pile that would spark larger flames. They dragged sticks half their size through the snow, proud to add their offerings to the stack. And when the fire finally roared, when the stove glowed with a steady red, they huddled close, stretching their hands toward the warmth as though it were treasure freshly unearthed. Asterisk, the pile outside was always under watch. Too small, and anxiety grew. Too large, and there was still worry, because no one could predict how long winter would linger. In the end, wood was never truly abundant. It slipped away piece by piece, each log burning down into ash that scattered easily at dawn. But in those brief hours when the flames leapt bright, when the cabin filled with the scent of pine and the sound of crackling, there was comfort. Fleeting, yes. Fragile, certainly. But comfort all the same. Asterisk, and in that glow, families could forget, if only for a moment, the endless cold pressing at the walls. They could close their eyes, feel the heat sink into their bones, and believe that fire, patient and steady, would carry them through. Asterisk, but the fire did more than warm the body. It drew people together, pulled chairs and hands and hearts into a circle around its iron guardian. The stove was no longer just a tool. It became the center of life itself. Asterisk, every log burned carried a story of labor already spent, You could almost hear the echo of the axe and the crackle of the fire, the memory of frost-numbed hands and shoulders stiff with strain. When the flames caught quickly, there was satisfaction. But when they resisted, when the wood smoked and smoldered before surrendering, it was a reminder of just how fragile warmth could be. Asterisk stacks of wood outside the cabin were more than just fuel. They were insurance, a visible measure of security against the unknown length of winter. A tall pile brought comfort, almost like money in the bank. A shrinking pile brought unease that grew sharper with each passing storm. Neighbors sometimes visited one another, not to trade food or stories, but to glance at the woodpile, to silently compare who was prepared and who might falter before spring. Asterisk, the work of gathering wood shaped the rhythm of the season. Even when snow lay thick on the ground, axes still rang through the woods. Trees that once offered shade in summer now offered survival. Settlers trudged through drifts to reach them, their boots crunching over frozen crust, each step a small battle with the cold. The forest in winter was quiet, but when the axe struck, the silence shattered, a sharp sound that seemed to travel for miles. Asterisk carrying logs back to the cabin was its own test. Arms grew tired, legs sank deep into snow, and the weight of each load pressed heavy on the chest. Some dragged sleds piled with wood, the runners screeching over ice, while others simply carried what they could, one arm full at a time. The journey back was slow, breath-breaking in clouds that drifted behind. Like smoke, by the time the pile was added to, the body ached, but the heart eased. The wall of logs had grown taller, and with it, the sense of safety. Asterisk, there was ritual even in stacking. Logs laid in careful rows, bark facing outward, ends squared and neat, not only for order, but for airflow. A stack poorly built might rot beneath the snow, or refuse to burn when needed most. So the woodpile itself became almost like another part of the household, tended and watched as carefully as the stove inside. Asterisk, and when the storm came, when winds howled and snow wrapped the cabin in silence, people would glance out the small window and feel relief just to see the outline of that pile standing steady. Each log was more precious than coins, more valuable than gold. For no matter how much wealth one imagined, in the middle of a frontier winter, wealth without firewood meant nothing. Asterisk inside, as the flames consumed the carefully gathered fuel, families sat close, knowing how much labor was vanishing in those bright bursts of heat. But the warmth sinking into their skin, the glow easing the stiffness from their bones, it was worth every swing of the axe. The woodpile might shrink, but in that moment, life felt possible again. Asterisk, and when eyes closed, when drowsiness finally pulled against the weight of cold, it was not the thought of riches or distant treasures that gave comfort. It was the memory of the axe striking, the smell of pine sap on gloves, the sound of logs splitting clean. That was the true wealth of winter, not gold glimmering in the earth, but fire glowing against the dark. Asterisk, yet the fire itself was nothing without the vessel that held it, the one iron companion that gathered families close and turned sparks into survival. Asterisk, the longer the winter dragged on, the more the woodpile became a silent companion, watched with the same attention one might give to a clock or a calendar. It told the story of time passing in its own way, shrinking slowly, unevenly, always too fast. Every log burned was a day survived, a night endured. But it was also a subtraction, a reminder that winter never stopped taking. Asterisk, there were arguments, sometimes quiet and tense, about how quickly the wood was being used. A fire that roared too brightly was comforting in the moment, but wasteful. Too much heat today might mean none tomorrow. So families learned to balance carefully, letting flames burn just enough to chase the bite from the air, never enough to squander. It was a strange form of wealth management, Not coins counted in purses, but logs counted in piles. Asterisk children often measured the winter by that same pile. Each morning they would glance at it through frosted windows, tracing the changes with their eyes. They grew to understand the meaning of scarcity long before they ever knew numbers, simply by watching wood disappear. When the stack grew low, their games grew quieter, their laughter softer, as though even they felt the weight of dwindling fuel. Asterisk neighbors, too, understood the quiet language of wood. A pile that stood high against a cabin wall suggested strength, foresight, preparation. A pile that shrank dangerously low was an unspoken call for help. And sometimes, even in the harshest winters, wood was shared, traded log by log like precious coins. Because no one forgot that, without fire, no roof, no blanket, no courage could save a body from the deep cold. Asterisk by the end of the season, when the pile was nearly gone, the final logs carried a weight beyond their size. They were handled with reverence, almost with ceremony. To place one carefully into the stove was to acknowledge every hour of labor, every blister and ache that had earned it. It was to admit that winter had almost won, and yet not quite. Because even with the last pieces of wood, even with ash thick, at the bottom of the stove, there was still warmth, still fire, still life. Asterisk, and so, when people spoke later of riches, of land claimed and gold discovered, they often forgot this quieter truth. In the frozen heart of the Wild West, wood was the true measure of survival. Without it, nothing else mattered. With it, there was at least a chance. Asterisk, but a chance needed more than logs alone. It needed the steady heart of iron, glowing red in the corner of the room, drawing every soul close to its warmth. Inside every cabin stood a silent guardian, the iron stove. Heavy, dark, and unyielding, it looked almost like a stubborn creature that refused to move, planted firmly in its place, commanding respect without words. It was not beautiful in the polished sense. Its surface was rough, its edges sharp, its door blackened from years of smoke. Yet it was the closest thing to a heartbeat the cabin possessed. Asterisk, from dawn until long past night, life revolved around it. A stove did not simply warm the air. It gathered people, pulled chairs closer, made hands stretch out until fingers tingled with heat. It was a circle of survival, and at its center, the stove glowed like a living ember. To sit by, it was too. Feel the body relax in small increments, the stiffness melting first from the hands, then from the shoulders, then from the chest. Asterisk, the sound it made was part of its language. The pop of sap releasing from the wood, the hiss of a damp log refusing to catch, the occasional clang when the metal shifted under heat. Even the creak of its door opening was distinctive, a slow, metallic groan that announced both promise and relief. These sounds stitched themselves into memory, becoming the background music of winter nights. Asterisk, the heat it gave was never even. Close to the stove, the air turned almost stifling, thick with warmth that reddened the skin. Just a few steps away, though, the cold returned, sharp and insistent, as if the stove's power ended abruptly at an invisible line. Families learned to navigate this uneven geography of warmth, inching forward until cheeks flushed, retreating back when the chill became bearable again. It was a constant dance, a negotiation between too hot and not hot enough. Asterisk above it, pots, always rested. Sometimes they were full, stews bubbling, beans softening, bread browning just enough to release a faint aroma. Other times they were empty, left there only to stay warm, waiting for the next chance to be filled. The stove was a kitchen as much as it was a heater, turning meager supplies into sustenance, transforming scraps into something that at least carried the comfort of heat. Asterisk children pressed their hands to its sides until they stung, laughing at the sudden shock, pulling back only to do it again. Adults were more cautious, but even they could not resist stretching their palms close, feeling the burn just before pain, holding on for as long as they dared. That sting was not unwelcome. It was proof that warmth still existed in a season, built from frost. Asterisk at night, when lamps burned low and the cabin grew quiet, the stove remained the only presence awake. Its faint red glow cast shifting patterns on the walls, shadows that danced with every flicker of the flame inside. The cabin might have been a simple box of wood, but with that stove alive at its center, it became something more, a place where survival carried a heartbeat, where the night could be endured one log at a time. Asterisk, and yet, even with the stove's steady warmth, life inside demanded more than fire alone. It required bodies wrapped in endless layers, fabric stacked upon fabric, turning every movement into something heavy, slow, deliberate. Asterisk, the stove had its moods, and everyone in the cabin learned to recognize them. When the fire was first lit, in the morning, the iron seemed reluctant, as if waking from its own slumber. The metal stayed cool for a long while, demanding patience, until finally the heat spread outward, cautious at first, then suddenly blooming in a steady wave. By midday, it radiated a confidence that filled the room, its sides almost too hot to touch, its top ready to receive whatever pot or pan could be balanced on it. Asterisk, but in the small hours of the night, when the last log burned low and no one stirred, to feed the flames, the stove grew tired. Its glow dimmed to a faint red line, and its voice fell quiet, save for the occasional faint crack. In those moments, the air inside the cabin shifted again, the chill reclaiming its place inch by inch, as if winter were simply waiting for its turn. Someone always had to rise, bleary-eyed, shivering, fumbling with kindling in the dark, to coax the embers back into flame. It was a ritual repeated countless times, the rhythm of survival measured not by clocks, but by fire. Asterisk, there was a trust placed in the stove that went beyond practicality. People sat near it not just for warmth, but for reassurance. Its glow meant the storm outside was kept at bay. Its hum meant that no matter how long the night stretched, there was still something alive in the room. It was a silent guardian one, that asked only for fuel and attention, and in return gave the gift of endurance. Asterisk, the stove also carried a scent that became part of memory. The sweetness of pine when fresh wood caught, the earthy heaviness of oak burning slow, the faint tongue of smoke that slipped into hair and fabric until it traveled everywhere with you. Clothes smelled of fire, hands smelled of ash, and the very walls of the cabin absorbed the aroma until it was impossible to separate the home from the stove itself. Years later, long after winter had passed, people could remember it instantly, that unmistakable mixture of heat, wood, and iron, the perfume of survival. Asterisk, even the ash left behind carried meaning. Each morning, someone scooped it carefully into a bucket, the fine gray powder rising in soft clouds, coating fingers and sleeves. It was not waste. Ash was used to scrub pots, to scatter on icy steps, sometimes even to make lye for soap when times demanded it. Nothing was lost. Even what fire consumed still had a purpose. Asterisk children sometimes sat on the floor and traced patterns in the thin layer of ash that clung to the stove's base, their fingers leaving little trails like lines on a frosted window. To them, the stove was both protector and plaything, a warm mountain that glowed and whispered, always alive, always present. Adults saw it differently. They saw the work it required, the danger of letting it die, the endless need for wood to keep it breathing. But whether seen through weary eyes or childish wonder, the stove was the center around which life turned. Asterisk, without it, the cabin was just a shell, a box of cold wood and rattling boards. With it, even the darkest night carried a small promise of comfort. The stove did not make winter easy. It made it survivable. And in that distinction lay the quiet heroism of daily life in the Wild West. Asterisk. But warmth was never only about the fire itself. To step away from the stove, even for a moment, was to feel the cold reclaim its hold. That is why the body, too, became its own defense, hidden beneath layer after layer of heavy clothing, until every movement felt like dragging the season itself on your shoulders. Asterisk, in truth, the stove was more than a tool. It was a companion, steady and unyielding, carrying the burden of an entire season on its iron shoulders. Around it, families gathered not just to share warmth, but to share themselves. Stories were told with faces lit by its glow, arguments softened as the flames snapped between silences, and long hours of waiting were made bearable by the simple, patient company of fire. Asterisk, the iron, blackened and scarred from years of use, bore the marks of countless winters. Scratches where logs had knocked against its sides, stains where grease had spilled, ends from hurried hands. It wore its history openly, as though keeping record of every night endured. And perhaps that was its truest role, to be memory made. Solid, the witness of every laugh, every sigh, every breath that turned into frost inside the cabin. Asterisk, when spring finally came, the stove cooled, sitting silently in the corner, almost forgotten as windows opened and fresh air poured in. But even then, it was never truly ignored. It waited quietly, knowing it would be needed again, patient as the earth itself, ready for the next long season of cold. Asterisk, because in the Wild West, a stove was not just furniture, not just iron shaped into utility. It was the hearth, the circle, the core of endurance. Without it, survival was unthinkable. With it, life, though hard and unyielding, remained possible. Asterisk, and yet, warmth inside was only half the battle. To truly endure winter, the body itself had to become another layer of defense, hidden beneath fabrics stacked one over the other until movement grew slow, stiff, almost mechanical. The stove might glow, but survival still depended on the weight of what you wore. Clothing in the winter West was never about style. It was about defense, about building a wall around the body as carefully as the cabin walls had been built around the home. A single shirt meant nothing. A single coat was not enough. Survival came in layers, piled one over the other, until the body carried the weight of its own protection. Asterisk, it began with the scratch of wool against the skin, a thick shirt worn over another, then another. Cotton underneath was already stiff, from repeated washings in cold water, but it served as the first barrier. Over that came wool again, heavy and rough, never quite comfortable, but always necessary. By the time the coat was pulled on, shoulders felt as though they bore not only fabric, but the entire weight of the season itself. Asterisk scarves were wrapped tightly around faces, covering noses and mouths until breathing felt like inhaling through. Cloth. Every exhale left a damp spot on the fabric, which soon froze, stiffening into a crust of ice. Still, the wrapping continued, layer after layer, because the bite of the wind was sharper than any inconvenience. Gloves, too, came in layers when possible, thin ones inside, thicker ones outside, though fingers still stiffened until they no longer obeyed with precision. Asterisk boots were another challenge. Leather hardened in the cold, stiff as boards, resisting. Every step, they squeaked and cracked with movement, as if protesting the weight they carried. Feet inside were never truly warm. Wool socks grew damp with sweat and froze again, leaving toes numb even after hours by the fire. Yet the boots were pulled on each morning, laces drawn tight, because without them, the snow would have swallowed every step. Asterisk, all of this layering made the body slow. Simple movements required effort. To bend, to lift, to turn suddenly, each was a negotiation with the clothes themselves. It was like carrying an invisible pack, one made not of tools or supplies, but of necessity. Children waddled like small animals under their bundles of fabric, arms outstretched, movements clumsy, but warm enough to endure. Adults bore it with resignation, knowing that without those layers, the cold would pierce straight to the bone. Asterisk inside. The cabin, the weight of clothing never fully disappeared. Even near the stove, garments stayed close at hand. Coats hung by the door like watchful guards, scarves draped over chairs, boots set near the hearth to soften their stiffness before the next morning's trek. There was never complete rest from the armor of winter. It was always near, always ready, always waiting. Asterisk, and in this way, clothing became more than fabric. It became a shell, an outer skin, a constant reminder of the season's grip. Every button fastened, every scarf tightened, every boot laced was part of the ritual of endurance. To dress was not to prepare for the day, but to prepare for survival. Asterisk yet, even under all those layers, one need remained constant: water. And in the depth of winter, water was no longer drawn from streams or wells. It had to be coaxed from the very ice and snow that surrounded the cabin, melted patiently by the same fire that warmed the air. Asterisk, every layer told its own story. A coat patched at the elbows carried the memory of past winters, each stitch marking a place where the fabric had worn thin under strain. Scarves were often mismatched, cut from old blankets or sewn from scraps, not chosen for beauty, but for the simple promise of warmth. Even hats, pulled low over ears, or the signs of use, edges frayed, crowns misshapen, wool stiffened by frost. Nothing was new. Everything was repurposed, repaired, and worn until it could not be mended anymore. Asterisk, the sound of winter clothing was its own language. Wool rubbed against wool with a heavy rasp. Coats creaked when stiffened by frost. Boots thudded on wooden floors, leaving behind clumps of snow that melted into small puddles near the hearth. The very act of moving became noisy, a collection of small frictions and clumsy impacts, as though the cabin itself echoed with the effort of simply existing under so much weight. Asterisk, and still, for all these efforts, cold always found its way in. It lingered on cheeks that no scarf could fully cover, reddening skin until it burned. It slipped between glove seams, numbing fingertips until holding an axe or bucket felt like gripping with stone hands. Even beneath layers, the cold pressed close, a steady whisper against the ribs, a reminder that nothing short of fire could truly drive it away. Asterisk, children felt the burden most vividly, bundled so tightly that arms stuck out like stiff branches. They waddled clumsily through the snow, falling often, laughing anyway. Their laughter rose into the brittle air, clouded by puffs of white breath, a brief spark of joy against the gray stillness of the season. Adults rarely laughed at the weight of their clothes. For them, the heaviness was not amusement, but endurance. To lift wood, to haul water, to mend fences, every task became slower, harder, under the drag of fabric. Asterisk, sometimes the layers themselves became small prisons. Wool itched against skin. Damp cloth clung after a day in snow, and sweat gathered beneath coats only to freeze once activity ceased. Peeling off garments at night was both relief and risk, relief in finally shedding the burden, risk in exposing the body to air so sharp it instantly. Many slept half-dressed, coats pulled over blankets, scarves wound loosely even in bed, unwilling to give the cold any opening. Asterisk, and so clothing was never just protection. It was participation in a season-long battle, a way of carrying the winter itself upon the body. Heavy, clumsy, uncomfortable, but essential. Without those layers, the stove's heat would vanish as soon as one stepped away, and the snow outside would become more than a landscape. It would become a threat. Asterisk, But warmth and clothing were not enough. The body demanded water, and in a world where streams froze and wells turned to solid ice, even something as simple as a drink required patience, fire, and time. Asterisk, in the end, the weight of clothing became as familiar as the weight of one's own body. Each day began with the same careful ritual of wrapping, tying, fastening, until the person beneath was almost hidden. And each evening, the same slow undoing, scarves unwound, boots tugged free with stiff fingers, coats peeled off only to be folded near the stove, ready to be worn again at dawn. It was a rhythm as constant as breathing, an endless cycle of valve, layering and unlayering that marked the passage of winter. Asterisk. There was no glamour in these garments, no elegance, no softness, only necessity. Yet within that necessity was a kind of quiet dignity, a determination stitched into every patch and pulled into every seam. These were not clothes chosen for who you wanted to be. They were clothes chosen for whether you wanted to survive. Asterisk. And so, the settlers moved through their days wrapped in the season itself, each layer a silent shield, each thread a fragile line drawn between warmth and the cold that never stopped pressing in. They worked, they walked, they endured, heavy, stiff, but alive. Asterisk still, survival meant more than warmth and layers. The body could be wrapped against the wind, but thirst could not be ignored. And in those long months when every stream froze, and every well turned to ice, water had to be drawn from the snow itself, melted patiently by the same fire that guarded the cabin. In the frozen silence of the Wild West winter, water was no longer something you could simply draw from a stream or dip from a well. It had to be coaxed patiently from the snow itself. Every drop began as a handful of light flakes scooped into a bucket, carried inside with cold fingers stiff from the air, and set down near the stove like a fragile offering to the fire. Asterisk. At first, the snow filled the bucket to its brim, light and fluffy, almost weightless. But as the heat touched it, the volume shrank quickly, collapsing into a shallow pool at the bottom. What looked like abundance became almost nothing. Families learned the disappointing truth that a bucket of snow melted into only a sip of water, clear and sharp, leaving them to fetch more and then more again, until the rhythm of melting became as constant as the rhythm of feeding the stove. Asterisk. The sound of melting was its own quiet song. Soft drops falling against iron, a faint hiss as cold water touched hot metal, the slow trickle gathering until the bucket offered something to drink. Children sometimes sat near the stove, watching the process as though it were magic snow, disappearing into air and liquid, something frozen becoming something alive again. Adults did not see magic. They saw work. Work that never ended. Work that had to be done if thirst was not to gnaw quietly at every hour of the day. Asterisk. The taste of that water was different. Clean, almost too clean, carrying no trace of soil. Or stone, just the faint softness of melted snow. It felt thin on the tongue, disappearing quickly, as though the body absorbed it faster than usual. Some swore it was sweeter. Others found it strangely empty. But no one complained. In winter, water was not for savoring. It was for surviving. Asterisk. There were tricks to make the process easier. Some collected blocks of ice from rivers before they froze completely, storing them in sheltered places to be chipped away when needed. Others packed snow into dense bundles before bringing it inside, hoping to gather more in one trip. But no matter the method, it was always slow, always repetitive. A dozen trips might yield only enough to cook a single pot of beans, or to fill a small jug for drinking. Asterisk. And still, the task had to be done. Thirst was patient, but relentless, and fire alone could not satisfy it. So day after day, snow was carried in, melted down, poured into cups that warmed the hands as much as they quenched the mouth. It was another ritual of endurance, another reminder that even the simplest needs became labor under the hand of winter. Asterisk. But if snow gave water, fire gave food. And though meals were plain, often repetitive, the comfort of something warm filling. The stomach could mean the difference between despair and endurance. Asterisk. There was a kind of patience required in melting snow that few could escape. You sat by the stove, watching the bucket slowly surrender its contents, waiting as the coldness dissolved grain by grain. Sometimes, when the fire was strong, steam rose in soft curls, filling the cabin with a dampness that clung to the air. It fogged the windows, frosting them from within, blurring the white world outside until it felt distant, unreachable. Asterisk, even with effort, water was never plentiful. It came in small cups, in ladles drawn carefully from the bucket, in bowls passed around the family with quiet precision. People learned to sip slowly, to stretch each swallow, to let the liquid linger on their tongues before it slipped down. Waste was unthinkable. A spill on the floor was almost a tragedy, a reminder that every drop had cost labor, fire, and time. Asterisk, and yet there was comfort in those small servings. To wrap hands around a tin mug warmed by melted snow was to feel a fleeting luxury, as though the winter itself he yielded something soft and gentle amid its cruelty. The water tasted of effort, of endurance, of hours carved from the storm just to bring a mouthful of relief. It was simple, yes, but survival was always simple at its core. Asterisk, the bucket beside the stove was never truly empty, never truly full. It was always in motion, filling with snow, shrinking into water, ready to be filled again. Like the fire that burned endlessly, it demanded attention, a quiet caretaker of thirst, a reminder that survival was made not in grand victories, but in small, repeated labors. Asterisk, and once thirst was eased, the next hunger stirred. Stomachs growled, not satisfied with water alone, calling for food that might warm the body from within. And though the meals were humble, they carried with them the same weight as fire and water, the power to keep another day alive. Hunger in the Wild West winter was not the loud demand it often is today. It was quieter, duller, a steady emptiness that sat heavy in the stomach and whispered through every chore. Food was not about taste, not about variety. It was about warmth, about something hot that could spread through the body and push back against the cold for a little while. Asterisk meals were often plain, almost repetitive, but they carried comfort far beyond their simplicity. A pot of beans simmering on the stove filled the cabin with a thick, earthy aroma, the kind of smell that clung to clothing and walls, promising sustenance long before the first bowl was ladled. Each bubble from the pot was like a small reassurance. There would be something to eat tonight. Asterisk bread, when it was available, rarely stayed soft. By the middle of winter it turned hard, the crust like stone, a center dense and dry. But dipped into hot broth, it softened just enough to be chewed, becoming more than bread, becoming warmth. That small transformation, from something nearly inedible to something comforting, was part of the quiet magic of food in winter. Asterisk stews stretched, ingredients as far as they could go. A few pieces of dried meat, a handful of beans, perhaps a carrot or potato if one had been stored well enough to last, all boiled together until they became more than the sum of their parts. The steam rising from the pot fogged the air, carrying with it a scent so rich that even the thinnest stew felt abundant. Asterisk tins and bowls were not just containers, they were heaters. To wrap cold hands around a metal cup filled with broth was to feel life returning to fingers that had stiffened all day. The heat soaked through the skin, spreading slowly inward, until even before eating, the body began to relax. By the time the first spoonful touched the tongue, the warmth had already done half its work. Asterisk children ate eagerly, their faces flushed by the stove, their spoons clattering against the bowls in small, hurried rhythms. Adults ate more slowly, savoring each bite not for its flavor, but for its weight, its promise of endurance. There was satisfaction, not in the richness of the meal, but in its presence, in the simple fact that there was something hot to be swallowed, something solid to quiet the hunger and push the cold further away. Asterisk, and when the bowls were empty, when the last crust of bread was gone, the satisfaction lingered. The body carried that heat for a time, moving more easily, speaking more softly, almost forgetting the endless storm pressing against the walls. Asterisk, but food alone could not banish the cold entirely. At the end of the day, when the fire burned low, and the cabin quieted, bodies turned to their beds, searching for rest in mattresses too thin and blankets too heavy, trying to find warmth in sleep that the stove could no longer give. Asterisk, there was no waste in those meals. Every scrap of bread, every last spoonful of broth was claimed. Bowls were scraped clean with crusts of bread, spoons licked free of the last trace of flavor. Hunger sharpened the appreciation of even the simplest bite, and nothing was left behind. What might have seemed plain in another season, or meager by modern eyes, became a feast when set against the long silence of the snow-bound night. Asterisk, the sounds of eating carried their own comfort. The clink of tin against tin, the soft slurp of broth, the low hum of satisfaction when warmth finally settled into an empty stomach. It was not lively conversation that filled the room, but these small, homely noises weaving together a sense of shared survival. In that quiet, even a humble pot of beans could feel like abundance. Asterisk food was more than nourishment. It was a pause. In the struggle, a moment when the cold retreated, just far enough for laughter to slip in, for shoulders to ease, for silence to feel less heavy. It reminded people that life was not only about enduring, but about tasting, smelling, feeling, even if those sensations came in the plainest of forms. Asterisk, and once the bowls were washed with melted snow, once the fire swallowed the last damp log, families prepared for the next challenge, rest. For food might warm the stomach, but the night remained colder than any meal could guard against. And so, bodies turned to beds, hoping that blankets and closeness would succeed where fire could not. When the day's work was finished, when the last log was fed to the stove and the cabin grew quiet, there remained the challenge of sleep. In the Wild West winter, going to bed did not mean entering comfort. It meant facing the cold in another form, lying down in a place that refused to hold warmth, no matter how many blankets were piled on top. Asterisk. The beds were often nothing more than wooden frames, topped with thin mattresses, stuffed with straw or dried grasses. At first touch, they crunched faintly, shifting beneath the weight of a body. The straw held shape, but it did little to hold heat. The cold seeped up from the planks of the floor and through the mattress itself, a steady chill that met the skin. Even beneath layers of fabric, asterisk blankets were thick, heavy, sometimes patched with scraps of old cloth or lined with animal hides. They pressed down like weight rather than warmth, making movement slow, almost impossible once settled. To pull them up over the shoulders was to feel both relief and burden, protection from the air, but also the sensation of being pinned in place. Asterisk, even under these layers, cold had its ways. It crept in at the feet, where blankets never tucked tightly enough, leaving toes aching and stiff. It lingered at the edges, where a shoulder might slip free in the night, sending a sharp shiver through the body. People often woke again and again, shifting, pulling the covers tighter, trying to reclaim the little heat their bodies had managed to build. Asterisk sleep came slowly, if at all. The body had to warm its own small pocket of air before rest could take hold. Hours passed before the chill faded, enough for drowsiness to become something deeper. And even then, dreams were restless, broken by the sound of wind, rattling the walls or the distant crack of ice outside. Asterisk families often slept close together, not from affection alone, but from necessity. Children nestled between parents, siblings crowded beneath the same blanket, each body adding its warmth to the others. The space was cramped, but the shared heat made it bearable. Breaths mingled in the darkness, rising as faint clouds that drifted above the blankets before vanishing into the black. Asterisk in these beds, comfort was rare, but survival was possible. The night might stretch long, the cold might creep in with every shift of fabric, but the weight of blankets and the closeness of family gave enough warmth to carry through until dawn. Asterisk, and when morning finally arrived, when the first gray light pressed through frosted windows, the beds released their occupants, stiff and weary, carrying the imprint of another night endured. They rose, stretching limbs that ached from both work and sleep, already reaching for boots and coats, already bracing for the day. Asterisk. But humans were not the only ones who needed warmth in those endless winters. Beyond the cabin walls, animals huddled in barns and sheds, breathing clouds of steam into the frozen air, depending just as much on care and fire to make it through the storm. Asterisk. The act of lying down at night was almost an agreement with the cold. You knew it would seep in, that the blankets would never be enough, but still you settled, because rest was not optional. Some tried tricks to chase warmth, heating a stone by the fire and slipping it into the bed, wrapping feet in extra rags, even tucking coats over the top of the blankets. For a few minutes, these efforts helped, but the cold always returned, steady and patient, as if determined to remind you of its presence. Asterisk. The sounds of the night were part of the struggle. The house groaned as the timbers shrank in the freezing air, sharp cracks echoing through the darkness, like distant footsteps. The stove popped softly as its last embers collapsed, the glow fading inch by inch. And in the spaces between those noises, silence pressed heavy, so complete that even a shifting blanket or a whispered cough seemed startlingly loud. Asterisk. Sleep was not deep. It came in fragments, in short stretches between wakings, as bodies stirred, to pull covers tighter or to curl closer together. Some nights it felt as though the bed was less a place of rest and more a place of waiting, waiting for dawn, waiting for the fire to be fed again, waiting for the season itself to finally loosen its grip. Asterisk. Still, there were small comforts. The weight of a blanket, though heavy, gave a sense of protection. The shared warmth of another body, even if cramped and awkward, gave reassurance. And the faint rhythm of breathing in the dark, rising and falling in unison, was its own lullaby, reminding you that you were not facing the cold alone. Asterisk. By morning, the bed carried the marks of the night, straw flattened, blankets tangled, a faint scent of smoke and wool clinging to every fold. Rising from it meant stepping immediately into the chill, feet striking the cold floor, breath already clouding in the air. Yet even stiff and unrested, people rose because there was no other choice. The day awaited, and with it, the endless duties of survival. Asterisk. And so, the bed was not a sanctuary, but a pause, a fragile pocket of warmth that held the body just long enough to recover before the fight began again. It was never truly warm, never truly restful, but it was enough to see another night through. Asterisk. Yet while humans layered themselves in blankets and straw, the animals outside faced their own battles. Horses, cattle, and chickens endured the same. Storms, waiting in sheds and barns where breath rose like smoke, each one depending on the care of the settlers to survive the long, frozen months. Asterisk. The truth was that the beds of the frontier were less about rest and more about endurance. They were places where the body recovered just enough to keep moving, not spaces of comfort as we think of them today. A mattress of straw could not soften the hardness of a winter night, and even the heaviest blanket could not erase the creeping cold. What they offered instead was the chance to endure until morning, to face another day with just enough strength gathered from uneasy sleep. People learned to accept this half-rest. They no longer expected the luxury of sinking into warmth, or the ease of waking refreshed. Instead, they measured a night's success by whether the fire still glowed faintly in the stove, whether toes still had feeling, whether children still breathed evenly under their layers of quilts. Rest was not deep, but survival was steady. And perhaps that was its own kind of comfort, knowing that even through shivers, through stiffness, through endless interruptions of sleep, the night had passed and life continued. Beds did not bring peace, but they gave persistence. And persistence was enough. By dawn, when pale light crept through frosted panes and the air inside the cabin felt colder than ever, families rose from their heavy blankets like soldiers climbing from trenches. The fight was not finished, but they had survived another night in a place where warmth never lingered. Yet beyond the walls of those cabins, survival was not only a human struggle. In the barns and sheds nearby, animals breathed clouds of steam into the frozen air, waiting for the same care, the same protection, the same patience that winter demanded from all living things. The cabins were not the only places that struggled against the weight of winter. Just beyond their walls, in barns and sheds hastily built with the same rough timbers, the animals endured their own battle with the cold. Horses, cattle, and chickens, creatures that made survival possible, needed shelter as much as the people did. Without them, there would be no milk, no eggs, no transport, no hope of work when spring returned. And so, each morning and evening, the care of animals became as essential as tending the fire inside. The barns were never warm in the way a cabin was. They were drafty, built quickly, their walls often thin, their roofs patched with whatever materials could be found. Still, straw was spread thick on the ground, layer upon layer, not for softness, but for insulation. It created a barrier between frozen earth and the heavy bodies of livestock, holding what little warmth could be gathered. Water was the hardest task. Buckets left overnight froze solid, thick ice, sealing the surface. Each morning, settlers carried axes or heavy sticks to break through, chipping and hammering until the water lay exposed again. Sometimes the buckets had to be carried inside, the cabin to thaw by the stove, the ice slowly surrendering under heat until animals could drink. The sound of a thirsty cow lapping at water, or a horse dipping its muzzle deep into the bucket, was a kind of relief, proof that, at least for now, they would last another day. Inside those barns, breath rose in heavy clouds, turning the air into a mist that hung low beneath the rafters. The sound of shifting hooves echoed through the space, steady and rhythmic, a reminder of life pressing back against the stillness outside. Chickens huddled together in tight clusters, feathers puffed, their bodies trembling softly as they passed. Warmth from one to the other. The smell was strong. Hay, damp wood, manure, but it carried reassurance. It was the smell of life, of warmth created by the animals themselves, a reminder that even in the coldest months, the barn was not empty, but alive. Farmers leaned against the wooden posts for a moment of pause, listening to the steady chewing of cattle, the low grunt of a horse, and felt a small peace in the routine. But caring for animals was never easy in the cold. Feed ran low, just as firewood did. Hay bales shrank each week, grain bins emptied, and every portion had to be measured carefully. To give too much today meant risking tomorrow. To give too little meant weakness, sickness, or worse. The balance was delicate. and every choice carried weight. Asterisk still, the bond between settlers and their animals deepened in winter. They were companions in endurance, all breathing the same frosty air, all waiting for spring's return. To place a hand on the warm flank of a horse, or to feel the steam rising from a cow's breath, was to touch life itself, fragile and stubborn, refusing to give in to the cold. Asterisk, and when the chores were finished, when buckets were emptied, and hay was scattered, the settlers stepped back into the snow, leaving the barn behind, listening to the muffled silence of winter once more. For beyond the walls of both barns and cabins, the world had grown quiet, blanketed in snow so deep that even footsteps were swallowed whole. Asterisk, for many families, the animals were more than labor, more than food. They were companions in the long struggle against the cold, creatures that endured the same storms and shared the same air. Their survival was deeply tied to the settler's own. A horse lost to the winter meant not just grief, but the loss of movement, of work, of possibility. A cow lost meant hunger that stretched beyond a single season. Asterisk, so each visit to the barn carried more than routine. It carried responsibility and a quiet gratitude. The pat of a hand on a warm hide, the soft nicker of a horse in recognition, the steady chewing of cattle in the shadows. These small moments reassured the farmer that life was still present, still holding on against the cold. Asterisk, the barn was never comfortable, never fully shielded from the icy wind that slipped between its boards. Yet inside, it carried a warmth different from fire, a warmth born of breath, of bodies gathered close, of shared survival. It was not enough to chase away the chill entirely, but it was enough to endure. Asterisk, and when the doors closed again, when the lantern was blown out, and only the soft sounds of animals remained in the dark, the settler stepped back into the snowbound silence. The cold pressed in instantly, swallowing every trace of heat, but behind him, the barn continued to breathe with the life it sheltered. Asterisk, out in the open, the world was muted. Snow blanketed the ground so thickly that even footsteps seemed to vanish into stillness. The silence of the season was vast, unsettling, and yet strangely beautiful. A landscape remained into pure white, where even the familiar became unrecognizable. Step outside the cabin in the middle of a Wild West winter, and the first thing that greets you is not a sight, but an absence. Sound falls away as if the world itself has been muffled. Snow does that. It absorbs, it swallows, it softens. The crunch of boots underfoot becomes the loudest noise in the world, each step sharp but quickly fading, leaving behind a hush so complete it almost hums. Asterisk, the air is heavy with stillness. Trees stand coated in white, their branches bending beneath the weight, not moving, not whispering as they do in summer. Fences disappear into drifts. Roofs are buried, paths erased. The familiar landmarks of daily life vanish beneath the snow, until the land itself feels strange, as though you have wandered into another world, one made only of white and silence. Asterisk, your breath breaks the quiet, rising in small clouds, drifting upward before fading into the pale sky. Even that sound, the faint hiss of breath leaving your lungs, feels intrusive, as if you've disturbed the perfect calm. The world outside seems to be holding itself still, waiting for something unseen. Asterisk, and then there is the wind. Not constant. Not always. But when it rises, it carries the snow in long, curling swirls, lifting powder from the ground and spinning it into the air like smoke. It whistles low against the edges of the cabin, rattles the brittle grasses still poking from. The drifts, then settles again, leaving silence in its wake. The hush after the wind fades feels deeper than before, like the pause following a whispered secret. Asterisk, for anyone stepping outside, the risk was real. The landscape's uniformity made distance deceptive. A barn that stood only yards away could vanish in a whiteout, leaving a person disoriented, wandering in circles just beyond their own doorstep. It was possible to be lost within sight of home, swallowed by the sameness of snow and the silence that masked every direction. Asterisk, and yet there was beauty too. A beauty so sharp and unyielding it felt almost sacred. The snow sparkled under moonlight, each flake catching light as though the ground were scattered with crushed glass. Under the sun, it gleamed blindingly bright, a sheet of brilliance that forced the eyes to squint. The silence was not empty, but full of waiting, full of presence, full of a stillness that seemed to stretch across the horizon. Asterisk, in that silence, even the smallest sound became enormous. A raven's wings cutting the air overhead sounded like the creak of old leather. A branch snapping under the weight of ice echoed like a gunshot. The distant call of a coyote carried across miles, sharper, lonelier, as if the snow itself amplified it. Every noise was isolated, distinct, unblended, like words spoken in a cathedral where the air itself demanded reverence. Asterisk, walking through that world felt both strange and intimate. Each step sank deep, snow packing beneath the boots, the crunch echoing in the ears. Sometimes the snow rose to the knees, making each movement an effort, the silence broken only by the sound of labored breathing. And when you stopped, when you stood still, the world returned instantly to its hush, as though you had never moved at all. Asterisk, the cold added to the stillness. Air so sharp that nostrils froze together on the inhale, breath crystallizing on scarves. And coats, fingers stiffening within gloves, despite the layers. Even sound seemed frozen, voices carried weakly, swallowed by the air, as though words themselves froze before they could travel. Asterisk, there was a strange comfort in it too. For in that silence, the usual noises of life, the chatter of chores, the clang of tools, the voices of neighbors, all disappeared. What remained was only the vast presence of winter itself, pure and unbroken, reminding you of your smallness. The silence of snow was not empty. It was a silence that filled you, pressed into your chest, demanded that you notice it. Asterisk, and so, while it carried danger, the risk of losing your way, the weight of isolation, the threat of storms that erased, even footsteps, it also carried a stillness that was unforgettable. A stillness that, for a moment, seemed to stop time itself. Asterisk, and perhaps that was the most haunting truth of those winters. The silence was not only around you, it was within. You, long hours outside, surrounded by the stillness, made thoughts slower, heavier, as though even the mind itself had been wrapped in snow. There were moments when the quiet felt almost endless, as if the world had forgotten how to speak, and you wondered if sound would ever return. Asterisk, yet the silence was not only harsh, it could be gentle too. Families remembered walking together under the pale glow of moonlight, their shadows stretching long across the white. No words were needed. The snow absorbed every step, every breath, until the only sound left was the steady rhythm of hearts moving forward in unison. In that shared quiet, there was peace, fragile but real. Asterisk still, the silence was deceptive. A sudden gust could erase tracks in seconds, sweeping the path behind you into nothingness. A simple chore, gathering wood, checking a fence, leading. An animal could turn quickly into danger when the world became a swirl of white, directionless, and blank. To live in such silence was to respect it, to remember that beauty and peril were never far apart. Asterisk when settlers returned inside, shaking. Snow from coats and stamping ice from boots, the muffled hush lingered. Even within the creaking walls of the cabin, the silence of the snow seemed to press against the windows, reminding everyone that outside was a world erased, waiting, holding its breath. Asterisk, but inside, another kind of challenge awaited. For the night stretched long and merciless, hours of darkness that refused to pass, when even the steady fire and the weight of blankets could not chase away the feeling that time itself had frozen. When the sun dipped below the horizon in winter, it did so quickly, almost as if it were eager to escape the cold itself. One moment the sky glowed faintly with the last streaks of pale gold, and the next, darkness pressed in from every side. The nights of the Wild West winter were not simply long, they felt infinite. Hours stretched heavy, each one dragging slower than the last, until time itself seemed to stall. Asterisk inside the cabin. A single lantern flickered, its flame trembling each time the wind forced a draft through the walls. The shadows it cast were restless, stretching long across the floor, then pulling back again with every shift of the flame. That weak glow became the only horizon within the room, a fragile island of light surrounded by a sea of blackness. Asterisk, the fire in the stove offered its own rhythm, glowing bright when freshly fed, then shrinking, dimming, demanding attention again. Family sat near it, listening to the soft groan of the iron, the snap of sap bursting in the wood, the occasional fall of ash. These sounds were comforting, but they also marked the passage of hours, as though the night itself were being counted. Log by log. Asterisk sleep came reluctantly. Blankets were heavy, the straw mattress uneven, and the cold never fully retreated. Even when eyes closed, the body stirred often, woken by the bite of air against an uncovered hand or by the eerie sounds of the cabin shifting in the freeze. Roof beams cracked under the pressure of snow. Walls groaned as the wind leaned hard against them, and each sound jolted the mind back into wakefulness. Asterisk, and when sleep did come, it was shallow, dreamlike, broken by the need to rise and feed the fire. Someone always stirred, a father, a mother, sometimes even a child, fumbling in the darkness to place another log inside the stove, watching for the faint glow of embers, whispering to themselves that the warmth would return. And they crawled back under blankets, shivering until their bodies once again claimed a little heat. Asterisk, the hours of darkness seemed to double in weight compared to daylight. Morning felt impossibly distant, as if the sun might never return. A person could wake 3 or 4 times, certain that dawn was near, only to discover the lantern still flickering, the stove still glowing faintly, and the black sky outside still unchanged. Asterisk, it was not just the cold that made the nights long. It was the silence, the stillness, the absence of distraction. Each creak of the house, each whisper of the wind, became amplified until it filled the imagination. The mind wandered in circles, replaying worries, measuring the woodpile in memory, wondering how many storms still waited beyond the horizon. Asterisk, sometimes the nights felt so heavy that even sound seemed reluctant to move. A cough in the darkness lingered longer than it should, echoing softly in the wooden room. The shifting of blankets carried across the silence like footsteps in an empty hall. Even the faint wheeze of the stove's breath, the air pulled in through its iron mouth, became a companion, something to listen to when the mind grew restless. Asterisk children asked questions in whispers, their voices muffled under quilts. Is it morning yet? The answer was almost always the same. Not yet. Time in winter nights was not measured by clocks, but by patience. Hours seemed to fold into one another, indistinguishable, each one marked only by the steady need to keep the fire alive. Asterisk outside, the world was black and white, the snow glowing faintly under moonlight, the sky stretching endless and starless on stormy nights. Windows frosted so thickly that the outside view became a blur, a soft glow of pale light with no clear shape. Sometimes the wind howled with a voice so sharp it seemed to claw at the glass, rattling the shutters, begging to be let in. Other times it died completely, leaving a silence so deep that it felt unnatural, as if the earth itself had stopped turning. Asterisk, for those awake in the dark, thoughts grew louder. Worries about dwindling food, about animals in the barn, about the strength of the cabin's roof under so much snow, they all pressed harder in the silence. A single spark of fear could grow large in the long hours, filling the space where daylight used to keep shadows at bay. Asterisk, and yet there were gentler moments too. A child rolling closer in sleep, a hand reaching under the covers to find another's warmth, a soft murmur shared between two voices in the dark. These small connections, fragile and fleeting, carried more warmth than the fire itself. They reminded the restless heart that the night, though endless, was not endured alone. Asterisk, and so the night stretched on, measured not by hours, but by flickers of flame and restless awakenings. To live through them was to accept that darkness was not an enemy to fight, but a companion to endure. Some mornings came with the strange sensation that the night had lasted a lifetime, as though years had passed between sunset and dawn. Yet the sun did return, slow and pale, slipping through frosted glass like a shy visitor, reminding everyone that even the longest night eventually gave way to light. Asterisk, the memory of those nights lingered long after winter ended. They taught patience in its rawest form, the patience of waiting for warmth, of waiting for sleep, of waiting for time itself to move again. There was no quick escape, no way to hurry the dark. One simply endured, hour after hour, until the faint glow of morning made the world feel possible again. Asterisk, but the cold was not only battled in silence or in sleepless hours. It pressed against the very walls of the home, demanding constant vigilance. The cabins that stood against the storms were never finished, never flawless, always in need of patching and repair to hold back the bite of winter. A cabin in the Wild West winter was never truly finished. It stood as a work in progress, a shelter that demanded constant care, as though it too were alive and struggling against the cold. Each storm revealed new weaknesses, a draft sneaking through where boards once seemed tight, a roof beam sagging under the weight of snow, a door that swelled and stuck in its frame from the frost. Survival meant listening carefully to these small warnings and answering them before they became disasters. Asterisk, during the day, when the pale light allowed, the sound of hammering often echoed across the snow. Nails were driven into wood already, weathered, new planks placed over gaps, old cracks stuffed with rags, clay, or mud frozen into place like cement. Each repair was temporary, a patch on a wound that would open again with the next storm. But even so, it was necessary. The cabin was never abandoned to chance. Asterisk, the smell of fresh-cut wood lingered in the air, mixing with smoke and frost. Inside, it carried the sharp tang of pine sap, the scent of labor that clung to coats and gloves. Sometimes the sound of the hammer startled the stillness, sharp and rhythmic, carrying farther than expected in the frozen quiet. It was a reminder not only of work being done, but of the constant struggle to hold the wilderness at bay. Asterisk children often watched repairs with solemn eyes, learning early that the walls around them were fragile. They saw fathers smear mud into cracks with bare, red hands, mothers hanging old quilts or pelts against doors to keep the draft from cutting through. Even the smallest hands helped, holding nails, pressing fabric into gaps, learning in silence. That warmth was never given. It was earned. Each repair, no matter how small, was an act of defiance. Against the wind, against the snow, against the long reach of cold that wanted to creep inside. The cabin might groan, might whistle, might shiver under the storm, but it stood. And so long as people worked to mend it, it remained a thin line. Between endurance and exposure, some repairs were crude, born from desperation. A crack stuffed with moss, a gap sealed with mud that froze solid overnight, a window covered with oiled paper when glass shattered under the cold. None of it was beautiful, none of it lasting, but beauty was not the goal. The goal was to stop the wind from biting deeper into the cabin, to keep the snow from finding its way inside. Every patch, no matter how makeshift, was one more layer. Between the family and the unforgiving night. The work was endless. As soon as one breach was sealed, another revealed itself. Boards warped, nails loosened, roofs sagged. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. No matter how tightly you pressed your fingers together, something always slipped through. And yet, settlers persisted. Day after day, hammer in hand, cloth at the ready, always searching for the next small wound in the walls. Sometimes the cabin itself seemed to resist the repairs. A new plank nailed over an old one would creak loudly, as if protesting the intrusion. Fresh mud smeared into a gap would crack and crumble the next time the wind shifted. But still, people returned to the task, patient, determined. They knew. The cabin was not perfect. It was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to stand just long enough, just strong enough to see them through. Inside, the signs of this constant struggle were everywhere. Patches of mismatched wood lined the walls, quilts tacked to corners, bits of burlap nailed over windows. Smoke sometimes drifted in where the stove's pipe met the roof, proof that the seal there had weakened. The home bore its repairs openly. A patchwork of survival stitched together piece by piece. And in the quiet moments, when the hammer fell silent and the wind eased, the family could hear the cabin breathing again, groaning at its seams, settling in its foundation, whispering through its cracks. It was never still, never flawless, but it was theirs, and it stood because they refused to let it fall. And so the rhythm of repairs became as familiar as the rhythm of the fire. The hammer was lifted almost as often as the axe. Boards and rags became as valuable as food, each one hoarded for the inevitable moment when the cabin demanded attention again. The settlers did not complain. They accepted it the way they accepted the cold, as part of life, part of the bargain struck with winter. The cabin, patched and imperfect, told the story of survival in every corner. A quilt nailed over a window was proof of a storm endured. A plank hammered unevenly into place showed the haste of a night when the wind had nearly broken through. These details were not flaws. They were memories written into the very structure of the home, reminders that survival was never smooth, never elegant. It was rough, uneven, but steady. And in the end, that steadiness was all that mattered. The cabin held, even when it groaned, even when it whistled with drafts, even when the roof bent low with the weight of snow. It stood because hands refused to let it fail. Each repair was a promise that the family inside would not give up, not tonight, not this winter. But even as the walls were mended and the roof reinforced, there remained another battle that no plank, no nail, no quilt could solve. The body itself suffered beneath the weight of cold. Skin cracked, lips split, and every breath seemed to leave behind its mark. The fight was no longer just against the cabin's weaknesses, but against the body's own limits. The heavy coats, the thick scarves, the boots stiffened by frost. They all fought against the cold, but beneath them the body still paid its price. Winter did not only press against the walls of the cabin, it pressed against the very surface of skin, leaving marks that lingered long after the season was gone. Asterisk hands bore the worst of it. Even inside gloves, the cold found its way in. Fingers swelled, split at the knuckles, and burned with a raw ache that never fully faded. Small cracks opened in the skin, red and sore, stinging with every chore. To fetch water, to carry wood, to mend a wall, each task reopened the tiny wounds until they became a constant throb. Some wrapped their hands in cloth before pulling on gloves, creating an extra layer, but still the chill crept through. Asterisk, the face too, suffered. No scarf could protect it completely. The wind cut across cheeks, leaving them raw, reddened, sometimes even blistered from the bite of frost. The tip of the nose burned, then went numb, then burned again when touched by warmth. Lips dried until they split, every word spoken carrying a small sting. Smiles came carefully, not from lack of joy, but because even laughter could reopen the skin. Asterisk feet endured their own punishment. Boots, though sturdy, never kept them truly warm. Toes stiffened, went numb, tingled sharply as the blood returned by the stove. Some nights, the ache was so deep it felt as though the cold had seeped into the bones themselves. Even layers of wool socks grew damp with sweat, freezing again when work outside slowed. The cycle repeated endlessly, a quiet torment at the edge of every step. Asterisk, and yet the skin did not simply suffer in silence. It adapted in its own way. Calluses thickened, sensitivity dulled, and pain became so familiar that it almost felt like a second skin. People lived with it because they had no choice, because in the balance between fire and frost, the body was always caught in the middle. Asterisk, even the air itself became an enemy. Each breath drawn in carried a sting, the cold burning deep into the lungs until the chest ached. Speaking too long outside left throats raw, voices hoarse, as though the very act of conversation was costly. Nostrils froze together with each inhale, a sharp, startling pinch that repeated over and over in the long walks through the snow. Asterisk children felt the cold differently. Their cheeks flushed crimson, their small hands chapped and rough far too early for their age. Mothers rubbed salves of lard or beeswax into their skin, not for comfort, but as a shield, a thin layer of grease to keep the wind from cutting deeper. It smelled faintly of smoke and fat, and though it left the skin sticky, it was often the only barrier they had. Asterisk, the body's protests were constant but quiet. Fingers that no longer bent smoothly, lips that bled at the corners, faces that felt tight and stretched as if carved from wood. No matter how much the clothes shielded, the skin bore the reminders of every day endured. And with each passing week of winter, the marks deepened, until survival itself could be read on the surface of a person's body. Asterisk, still, no one stopped. The chores demanded hands, no matter how cracked they were. The animals demanded care, no matter how stiff the joints became. The fire demanded wood, no matter how raw the skin grew from gripping the axe. The body protested, but the will pressed forward, layer after layer, day after day, until pain itself became part of the season. Asterisk, and so the skin became the true ledger of winter. Every crack, every blister, every burn from the wind was a mark of the season written across the body. Long after the snow melted, long after the coats were folded away, those memories lingered, roughened hands, weathered faces, the quiet ache. In bones that had learned too well the sharpness of cold. Asterisk, there was no hiding it. The winter carved its story openly, leaving each person marked by its passing. A glance at a neighbor's face, red and chapped, or at their hands, raw and swollen, was enough to know They had endured the same battle. In this way, the suffering was strangely unifying, a language written not in words, but in skin. Asterisk, and yet there was resilience in it too. Bodies bent, but did not break. Smiles still appeared through split lips. Laughter still rose into the cold air. Work still carried on despite the ache in every joint. Pain became routine, and routine became survival. The skin bore the cost, but life continued. Asterisk still, even as bodies adjusted, winter tested health in ways no coat or salve could mend. Illness lingered in the corners of cabins, quiet and stubborn, waiting for weakness to creep in. With few remedies and fewer doctors, people turned to whatever they had: herbs, heated cloths, whispered hope that the body would be strong enough to endure. Illness in the Wild West winter came quietly. A cough that lingered, a fever that refused to break, a body that grew weak after too many nights of shivering. These were not rare events, but constant threats. The cold itself wore people down, thinning their strength, leaving them vulnerable to every sickness that drifted through the season. And in a world where doctors were distant and medicine scarce, care fell into the hands of families, who made do with what little they had. Asterisk herbs gathered in warmer months were stored carefully, dried and tucked into jars or cloth pouches. Chamomile, peppermint, yarrow, simple plants turned into teas that promised relief, if not cure. A pot simmered on the stove, filling the cabin with steam and the faint, earthy scent of leaves releasing their last strength into water. Cups of this bitter brew were pressed into trembling hands, sipped slowly as though warmth alone could fight sickness back. Asterisk warm cloths, too, became medicine. Strips of fabric were dipped into hot water, wrung out, then pressed against aching chests, sore throats, or joints stiffened by the cold. The relief was temporary, fading as the cloth cooled, but for a few moments it gave the comfort of heat seeping into pain. Families repeated this ritual again and again, patient as the night, trading exhaustion for the small mercy of easing a loved one's suffering. Asterisk, there was no pharmacy to turn to, no endless cabinet of remedies. The pantry itself became the medicine. Chest, honey, if it was available, soothed throats raw from coughing. Garlic was boiled into broths, its sharpness believed to strengthen the body. Vinegar was used in washes, its scent sharp in the cabin's air. These cures were not guaranteed, but they were all that could be offered. Hope poured into whatever form the season allowed. Asterisk, and sometimes care was nothing more than silence. A body too weak to rise was left to rest under heavy blankets. The fire kept alive nearby, family members moving softly to avoid waking the sick. The air in the cabin grew heavier on those days, filled not with talk or laughter, but with the weight of waiting, of listening for each shallow breath. Asterisk illness carried a different weight in winter. A simple fever in summer might pass with rest, but in the depths of cold, it became dangerous. The body already weakened by hunger, by sleepless nights, by the constant bite of frost, had little strength left to fight. Families watched closely for signs: a cough that deepened, a face flushed too hot despite the icy air, lips that lost their color. These small changes were read with the seriousness of omens. Asterisk, sometimes remedies were shared among neighbors. A jar of honey traded for a pouch of dried mint, a handful of onions swapped for willow bark. These exchanges were not done lightly, for everyone had little, yet they gave what they could. Illness was not only a private battle, but a danger that threatened the whole community, and in such times the thin line of survival often depended on generosity as much as medicine. Asterisks, still, there were nights when no remedy seemed to work. The fire burned high, Blankets were piled thick, yet the sick grew weaker, their breath rattling in the silence of the room. In those moments, the cabin seemed to hold its breath with them. The family moved quietly, speaking in murmurs, every sound muffled as though the walls themselves understood the gravity of the hour. Asterisk. And when recovery came, it was slow, fragile, uncertain. A fever finally broke, leaving the body drenched in sweat. A cough softened, losing its sharp edge. Strength returned one careful step at a time. A spoonful of broth here, a sip of water there. Each improvement was treated like a gift, celebrated. With quiet relief, though everyone knew another illness could come as easily as the last. Asterisk. And so, health in the Wild West winter was never taken for granted. A body that could rise from bed each morning, that could carry wood, fetch water, or simply sit by the stove without trembling, was a blessing. Illness was not measured only in symptoms, but in its ability to steal time, to take away the strength needed for survival. Even the mildest sickness became a shadow stretching over the household, reminding everyone how narrow the path between endurance and collapse truly was. Asterisk. The remedies, though simple, carried meaning far beyond their ingredients. A steaming cup of bitter tea was more than just herbs and water. It was care, it was love made tangible. It was the stubborn will to fight with whatever means the season allowed. A cloth warmed by the fire and laid gently on the chest of the weak was a kind of promise. You are not alone in this battle. Asterisk. And though many winters left scars, both visible and hidden, most families carried on. Illness came and went, as storms did, and people learned to meet both with the same quiet patience. They had no certainty, no cure, only endurance. And endurance, in its plain and stubborn way, was enough. Asterisk. But sickness was only one fear. Hunger. And cold still pressed daily at the door. And with every storm, the question returned, would the woodpile and pantry last until spring? Or would winter demand more than families had left to give? More than the cold itself, more than the storms that swept across the plains, the true fear of winter in the Wild West was scarcity. Wood and food were the two pillars of survival, and both were fragile. Both could vanish faster than anyone expected. Families lived with a quiet anxiety that grew sharper each time the woodpile grew smaller, or the pantry shelves looked barer. Asterisk. The wood was watched constantly. Piles that once seemed tall and secure shrank one log at a time, each piece vanishing into the stove's hungry mouth. A storm could devour a week's worth of fuel in only a few days, forcing settlers to measure each log as though it were gold. Some nights the fire was allowed to burn low, just enough to keep frost from forming on the walls, but not enough to chase away the deep chill. It was not comfort they guarded, it was survival. Asterisk. Food carried the same weight of worry. A sack of beans dwindled spoonful by spoonful, a jar of flour scraped thinner each week. Shelves that once held jars of preserves, onions, potatoes, or dried meat grew empty, until only shadows remained. Each meal became smaller, stretched thinner, shared more carefully. A loaf of bread was cut into pieces so small they hardly filled a hand, but still it was divided equally, each portion a reminder that every bite mattered. Asterisk. The fear was not traumatic. It was quiet, steady, always present. Each time a mother opened the pantry door, she counted what remained. Each time a father glanced at the woodpile, he measured its height in his mind, comparing it to the weeks still left before spring. Even children, though they did not speak of it, felt the tension. They noticed the smaller bowls, the thinner soups, the way adults stared too long at shelves that once seemed full. Asterisk and outside, the storms showed no sympathy. Snow fell heavier, winds blew colder, and the world remained locked in white silence. It was impossible to know how long the season would last, or how much more it would demand before it finally relented. Asterisk, the fear showed itself in small habits. People counted the logs in the pile again and again, as though numbers might change if checked often enough. They shook sacks of grain, listening to the faint rattle inside, weighing them in their hands to guess how many meals still remained. They tapped jars, holding them up to the lantern's glow, trying to see whether the bottom was closer than they dared admit. Asterisk meals became cautious rituals. A pot of beans was stretched with more water, turning hearty stew into thin broth. A piece of bread was dipped into soup to soften it, making it last longer than it should. Children were given slightly larger portions, adults slightly smaller. The balance shifted quietly without discussion. Hunger was carried silently, worn on weary faces but rarely spoken aloud. Asterisk, the anxiety grew worse during storms. When the wind howled and the snow buried doors and windows, no one could fetch more wood, no one could hunt or trap or gather. They had only what was stacked and stored, and every storm became a test of whether the supplies would last until calm returned. Nights were the hardest, staring at the fire as it consumed log after log, knowing each flame was both warmth and loss, comfort and cost. Asterisk, and yet there was no choice but to continue. Families clung to patience, rationing every bite, burning only what was necessary, hoping that tomorrow might bring a softer wind or a sky clear enough to allow for gathering more. Survival was never a matter of abundance. It was a matter of endurance, of holding on with less and less until the season loosened its grip. Asterisk, and when the shelves grew nearly bare, when the woodpile outside was no taller than a child, fear became a constant companion. Every gust of wind seemed sharper, every creak of the cabin heavier, as if the winter itself knew how close survival had come to its edge. People sat by the stove in silence, watching the fire eat the last of the logs, knowing each one was more precious than gold, more precious than any coin ever dug from the earth. Asterisk, but there were moments of relief too. The sudden break in a storm, the return of sunlight after days of gray, the sound of dripping water when snow finally began to soften. These signs carried hope, fragile but powerful. A single day of thaw meant the chance to gather more, to stretch the supplies just a little further. And when that happened, the cabin filled not with laughter, but with deep, quiet breaths, the kind of relief that comes from knowing you will make it one day longer. Asterisk, this was the true rhythm of a frontier. Winter, the endless counting, the careful stretching, the patience to endure. It was not a story of grand victories, but of small triumphs measured in cups of broth and piles of wood, in nights survived and mornings welcomed with gratitude. Asterisk, and when the fear finally began to fade, when the snow softened and the first streams trickled again, it felt like more than just a change of season. It felt like proof that all the labor, all the waiting, all the worry had not been in vain. Asterisk, the thaw did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, gently, almost shyly, bringing with it a new sound, the sound of water moving again, of ice surrendering its grip, of the world waking after its long silence. It never came with trumpets or celebration. The first thaw of winter arrived quietly, almost secretly, like a guest slipping into a room without knocking. One morning, settlers woke to a sound they had almost forgotten, the soft drip of water. At first it was faint, irregular, a single note against the silence. But soon it repeated, steady, insistent, as icicles along the roof began to loosen, melting drop by drop into the waiting earth. Asterisk, the air smelled different too. Gone was the sharp, metallic sting of frozen wind, replaced by something softer, fresher, as though the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Even inside the cabin, with its smoke and damp wood and patched walls, that new scent drifted in, carrying the promise of change. Asterisk snow no longer held its rigid form. It sagged, slumped, lost its brightness. Paths that had been buried for months began to reappear in muddy streaks. The ground beneath showed itself shyly, patches of brown earth breaking through like islands in a sea of white. For the first time in months, footsteps no longer crunched so sharply. They squelched, sinking into the damp softness of thawing snow. Asterisk and the light changed too. Days stretched longer, their shadows less severe. The sun, though still pale, reached deeper into the world, casting reflections across melting drifts until the land seemed alive with tiny rivers of light. It was not yet warmth, not truly, but it was promise. A reminder that winter, no matter how endless it had felt, was not eternal. Asterisk inside the cabin, the mood shifted with the season. People leaned closer to windows, listening to the dripping, watching as frost pulled back from the glass. They spoke more freely, voices lighter, even though the shelves were still bare, even though the woodpile was nearly gone. The thaw itself was enough to stir hope, hope that food would grow again, that rivers would run, that green would return to the fields. Asterisk, the thaw was never instant, never complete. Even as streams trickled and icicles fell, snow lingered in the shadows, stubborn and slow to release its hold. Nights were still cold, fires still needed tending, but the grip of winter had loosened. Each morning carried a little more light, a little more softness, until people could almost believe they had stepped into another world. Asterisk, the animals felt it too. Horses stomped eagerly in muddy barns, their breaths no longer clouding the air so heavily. Chickens ventured out, clucking as they scratched at patches of exposed earth. Even the cattle moved differently, less hunched, as though they too sensed that survival was no longer in question. Asterisk and the settlers themselves changed. Their faces, cracked and raw from the wind, softened in the gentler air. Their movements, once heavy with the drag of endless layers, grew lighter as coats were shed, as boots loosened their stiffness. The weariness did not vanish. It clung, in bones and memories, but it was tempered by relief. Asterisk, there were no grand celebrations, no cheers, no feasts. Only the simple acts of standing outside longer, breathing the damp air, listening to water drip and flow as if it were music. Perhaps a smile came more easily. Perhaps a laugh rose without effort. The thaw carried no riches, but it brought the most valuable gift of all, the knowledge that they had endured. Asterisk, another winter was behind them. Another trial survived. The season had pressed and bent and scarred, but it had not broken them. And as the last snow melted into the earth, it left behind not only mud and water, but a quiet certainty that life, stubborn, fragile, and persistent, would always return. In the stories we tell of the Wild West, the winters are often left in the shadows. We remember the dust, the gun smoke, the clang of spurs, the glare of sun on endless plains. But survival was never only written in heat and dust. It was also carved into frost, into long nights, into cabins that groaned under the weight of snow. God asterisk, to live through those winters was not about conquering the cold. No one conquered it. It was about learning to bend with it, to endure its silence, its cruelty, its endless patience. Survival meant patching walls that would break again, feeding a fire that would never be satisfied, wrapping in clothes that slowed every step, eating food that filled more with heat than with flavor. It meant watching hands crack, lips split, wood piles shrink, and still rising each day to face the same season without complaint. Asterisk resisting the cold was not a battle fought once. It was a routine, repeated every hour, every day, until the thaw finally returned. That routine was the quiet heroism of the frontier, not dramatic, not glorious, but steady, stubborn, unyielding. Asterisk, and perhaps there is something familiar in that. Even now, we no longer patch cabins with mud or melt snow for water by the fire, but we still know the weight of endurance. We still wake in nights that feel too long, count what remains when supplies run thin, and measure time in small, steady acts that carry us forward. The struggles change, but the rhythm of survival remains. Asterisk in the end, winter always passed. The ice melted, the rivers ran, the fields greened again, and those who had endured stepped out into the thaw, carrying the marks of the season on their skin, in their memories, in their quiet strength. Not victorious, not triumphant, but alive. And in a land as harsh as the Wild West, that was enough. Asterisk, thanks for being here. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.